say that there are residual restrictions against different kinds of sacrifice there. However, the first argument is that these state restrictions are not going to be the same qualitative difference as a federal BART restriction. There are always other places in non-state lands that this can happen. We just have the blood orgies on federal land. States don't have jurisdiction. Jurisdiction overrides. They say non-sacrificial orgies doesn't particularly matter because our argument is oriented towards the sacrificial nature of erotic sacrifice through death. That's the Stoeckel and Hogerkrath evidence. This is all just defense of the fact that we can create that transgression against the way that we utilize and restrict ourselves against the glorious experience of letting ourselves go in the status quo is enough to solve. They say we accumulate the ballot vote. We break the continuity of explanation. That's the ballot is a recognition of the wounded knowledge that they put off and try to explain. That's our Stoeckel and Hogerkrath evidence. The affirmative boils down to, we have boiled down to saying that there are good parts of affirming something, their argument is that we boil down to saying that there are good parts of affirming something, which then equates to attempting to accumulate the ballot. However, you do not vote simply for the ballot in terms of we attempting to accumulate it. You fill out the ballot because you think that we've made the correct arguments about sacrifice, meaning that you can fill out the back of the ballot to sacrifice being negative. They conflate our critique of future utility with a critique of choosing different courses of action based on an imminent benefit or desirability. That's not restriction. Our Stoeckel evidence frames the difference. Our affirmation of unproductive and unknowable accursed share of the types of energy that we can have through sacrificial orgy implodes the logic of utilization and attempting to accumulate the ballot. It implodes the reason and meaning of the ballot from within. That'll be lower. Universal negation. First off, as we transgress civil society, the attempt to accumulate and always have different respectfulness and ability to put off transgression and not accept the inner death and violence of communication between us is literally this modern restriction, the subject-object dichotomy that enforces these sort of ideas of shadowness and the ability to create a kind of economy of restriction and labor that creates the root of these problems. The question is how we affirm. They always are going to assume that we affirm in the traditional notion as a way to prove that we affirm in the traditional notion. You should disregard the circular logic. Our argument is about misuse of the resolutional object in terms of destroying its position in the economy of accumulation. That's the Stoeckel evidence. We have our counter-interpretation of universal affirmation. The cross-ex argument was that we can destroy competition too. I don't know what internal links that they're going to draw, but I think that this distinction is arbitrary. When you fill out the basis of the decision, you say that you're filling it out for a universal affirmation to destroy the debate in the same way that you fill out for the universal negation. They don't solve with one ballot. There are 60 other rounds going on right now that will all vote the same way, and they don't make this argument on the affirmative. It means that they just collapse back into this traditional debate practices as well, meaning that if these arguments become the same thing in the block, they're also collapsing back down to civil society, the wilderness of debate, because they're just going to reinject into the same traditional economy, and you link just as hard to traditional debate practices. Nobody's giving a 30-minute to constructive here. Nobody's reading like a bunch of exploding in terms of traditional debate. We're all flowing or spreading and reading pieces of evidence. There's no distinction between what types of debate practices feed to this traditional civil society economy and not. The battalion blood sacrifice is not unique, or is not unique. They make the argument that our politics has happened before. I'd really like to have you point to an example of where people have had a discursive movement based on the violence of communication and attempt to bring down modernity by introducing toxins of the impossible into reasonable calculations of utility using blood sacrifice. That is not an argument that has been played out in our political discourse, and only adding the affirmative can solve because it creates friction and results in mutual action. The exclusivity between these two things is actually a benefit for endorsing the affirmative of permutation of the impossible Adams 2K2. This argument began differences such as the coalition ability to negotiate among political actors between goals of materiality, discourse different, the sameness, within oneself, and discourse different, the sameness, and connect mutually one syntax, one grammar, not taking for the subject, continuity, sensibility, displace one another, to make meaning, serve the binary logic of sameness and difference, looking into intention with another, suppressing the flexibility of multiplicity of complex identity. This long difference before the will consider that possible the evolution of operator differences being along with that prior selfhood. What was it? We destroy the notion of humanism. We are sacrificing the sovereignty of the human, the idea that we should secure for a better future, the idea that we should utilize. This is the idea of a modern subject-object dichotomy, which we implode from within. The alternative can't destroy the state. We must redirect this sovereignty to destroy itself, introducing the toxin of impossible into modernity's calculations of utility. The subject-object dichotomy, that's Irwin 2K2. The type of physical subversion can only be enacted, communicated, performed without a set of medical proposition, the rest of the political thesis, but a style of life lacerated, living, cold, alternative values and forms of experience, the culminating totalitarian version of morbid system experience cannot be adequately described in philosophical, social, scientific, political discourse, the concept of unbelieving intoxication. I'm not a philosopher, but a saint of meditational, about physical style experience, open to root to genuine freedom and experience, basic condition, learning, meaningful deployment, freedom, public, political world meaning, initiates autonomy, condition to the atoms, contestation, negative experience, showing the self will die, freedom, temperate, awareness, radical vulnerability, contingency, freedom, inseparable from compassion, tragic loyalty, that the sacrificial knowledge of one's own penetration by death, the soft such as freedom, and become next righteousness and power over others. They enter experience the sacrificial conquest of others for others. Thus, sovereignty is not a static governance, but a tireless revolt. This is the underlines are overflows conceptual structures by which a lot of domination realizes the tax, utility, rationality, hierarchical order, and identity by a firmly useless center of experience itself as a sole authority, sole value of the system, challenge the written course of political system to claim ultimate value and unlimited authority for themselves by introducing their auto-sacrificial remedy, the tax and the impossible in the calculations of human meaning, but so to reach the underside of language and human experience to recover the nakedness of irreducible anguish and the philosophy of political theory sought to conceal the nullity effects of realistic discourse. Mystic one speaks of death within death, and the war piece of human illness begins to deploy the riches of death and eternal as one life can be affirmed in love through death. This embodies this affirmation, physical dissolution, just as possible to watch oneself ceasing to be the experience of a way of country, death, possible reality and obviousness of the truth we should laugh at. A certain form is found to the real hypothesis that has this reference made to the possible ideation of reality, company, polarity, theory, dialectical, philosophical solutions. The other form thought is an illusion, playing with reality, seduction, desire, truth, and reality of thought is material illusion, extrapolation of the world through another world. These events is incommensurability through thought of the real, what invention, singularity, thought, what constitutes an event, and permutation, vote affirmative, and burn down everything. The plantation is the standing preserve and reduction of objects to labor so that we can utilize and create an accumulation of and draw energy off of them like the gas station so we can live our life of capitalist leisure and the use of these abilities in order to continue more accumulation. The failure to break this down is always going to be one that avoids sovereignty and avoids spending the excess. We must actually squander this excess and destroy the accumulative potential. The excess doesn't go anywhere just by rejecting it. You can't simply burn it down. You have to squander it, and the alternative fails, presuming ontological whiteness obscures the sheer cultural practice and power structures of green scraps oppression. Welcome to 2004. Oppositional identity said be rejected of all things, white formulation, dichotomous nature of action, so white, sublogical identity determines what is white, like identity is vastly determined as of white, personal identity, reason, variables, traits, dynamics, arguably identities, actually group reference orientation, this paradox, the result of true whiteness, non-logical consistency, obfuscation of nature, identity is not changed from group to group, and narrative of black, so theoretically untenable, while locating the origin of black identity, those passive conversions of white identity related to black obscure fitting situation, which by the activists to oppose freedom to determine the construct of the identity of denying black actors. And President Day proves burning it down is not a sustainable political strategy. The only way to achieve, is not an actual good or way to effectuate a resistance against this. The only way to achieve gratuitous freedom is to affirm your identity within the material conditions to transgress that limit that you are affirming as a limit that you can transgress against. Human 3. Freedom is more than just the absence of constraints, objective, repressive level of freedom, because it's essential self that is restricted. Liberation cannot operate as the basis for freedom. Business freedom can be established on the basis of liberation only by new domination rather than freedom. Liberation of essential self from the culture of the chases active and deliberate practice of inventing oneself is not taken metaphysical planes beyond the limits of rather works the limits of constraints of the present. More importantly, those who work constructed upon the limits of ourselves, our own identities, radical reconstruction, self-necessary necessary act of resistance. We don't endorse the sexist language of that evidence. And the victim mindset, James, or that part. We have this add to the social death argument. What is this conception of social death is based off of a flawed methodology which interrupts the transformative potential of the African diaspora. We should understand the fact that we are all socially dead in the world of modernity. Only by misusing our utilization as objects can we resist the 8 and 11. What is this black social death idea to the theoretically troubled ignoring the African diaspora? It's what listens to couple of things that carry the weight of geospatial argument, the attempt to advance the idiocentricity, the specificity of spell knowledge, the rhetoric of white blacks, particularly undeveloped sense exaggeration of blinkeredness. I wonder if it makes the countless or sense slave ships of blue or in resurrections and during the middle passage once most there is like social anthological deafness suggests being nowhere, there's no way to be that. And they forsake the potential of transgression and the revolt in this world because of the way that we always understand ourselves as death should rather be the position in which we use for further action. This is the urban evidence frames. This is about our relationship to death and whether we can accept the sacrifice and rejecting and understanding social death as inexplicable inescapable is necessary to create positive change. Brown and 9. Studies of labor connected in terms of social history, taking agency to start putting agency, weakened power structures, often viewed as simple opposites. The beneath slaves to general political action is not an antithetical tendencies to fear, so that it's not his incapacity, but generative force. Therefore, was a slave slides to view one objects of slave politics, elements of slave culture, very terms, conditions of social existence. And the essentialism argument, the assumption of ontological whiteness that generates a blackness of racial category subservient to whiteness, welcome and forced experience of whiteness, complex into the behavior of the construction of warrants, rules, the influence of validated black experience, the events of ontological fitness limits the ratio, black agency producing deceitful narratives, which the navigation of social environment by the blacks is dictated by a passive adoption of white script and the utilization of whiteness determined blackness begins the whiteness of the white life histories come to represent what is right as a prominent white is right perspective can be traced in attempts to create an order. And that's fine.
How are we all in this together?
How are we all in this together?
Yeah, you said that a bunch of times.
I mean, I don't think I used that particular wording.
That's basically what you said. So how are we all in this together?
I mean, like, I have to know what argument you're referring to because
you're referring to the way you tag the bot evidence, saying that we are all socially dead. You make the argument.
Okay, yeah.
At the top.
I understand what you're getting at now. The we're all socially dead argument is that there's not necessarily a particular position of modernity that excludes us from the order of the living. Of course, this is distributed inequitably.
Go back. You said there's not what?
There's not anything in the condition of modernity that explicitly and only expels the black body from being recognized as a subject.
There's nothing in it, so not even that is the basis of modernity, is that expulsion?
You're misunderstanding my argument, sort of. I'm not saying that modernity doesn't have, I should rephrase. It's not,
Yes.
it's like, of course modernity does expel the black body.
The
It's
very
just, that's not
basis,
the only
our
thing.
argument is the very potential for modernity to be, is that disavowal. So how is it that modernity doesn't,
Because modernity disavows the object, but our argument is that there
Which
are
is
other
the slave.
objects that
No.
modernity disavows.
what
and there's
evidence do
black
you
body.
read that there's other objects?
I mean, that by evidence, but also
That
our
Ba
own
evidence is an indite of Wilderson's book, it's not an indite of the
Sure, it's
general
an
idea.
indite of, no, there's a line that refers to Wilderson's book, but it is in the context of making the,
It's in the
indicting
context of
argument
people
he makes
in
Red,
the
White, Black.
Brazilian, Afro-Brazilians, and how she's saying that
Yeah,
there's
she-
fluidity with race relations there, so he can't say that people are all
She's
framed
using
by
it as a
blackness.
counterexample, and that's one of the arguments. We also make the argument that we're
Counterexample,
universally.
but you don't read any evidence on the basis of like how modernity is shit.
No, we do. Irwin says that modernity is shaped by the fundamental subject-object dichotomy.
Subject, object, but there's, okay, cool. all your 1AC evidence talks about like how there's this, and we're in the universe and that humans feel like they're spinning. What part of the, what do you mean by humans? Like, what does your evidence mean by humans?
Hovercraft, Hovercraft probably doesn't mean anything by humans. I don't think that we would
Does it mean
defend.
anything by humans?
Yeah, I think that Hovercraft is using that phrase
Humanity.
rhetorically to mean like
Rhetorically?
people who are on Earth, like.
What does the app do? Like, how exactly are we a blood orgy sacrifice? Like, what is
We've removed, like, what is it?
yeah, like, how does the app do blood orgy sacrifice blood orgy? I'm
Well,
sorry.
we removed restrictions on having.
What
sex-
restrictions are there?
Blood orgies. You can't murder people, you can't have.
What do you mean you
orgies on
can't
public
murder
property.
people? I can easily murder people.
Well, those are restrictions on it.
Which,
yeah.
what's the restriction?
That you can't commit murder
Why not?
because it'll take you, put you in jail. We read a ton
So
of
jail is
dissents to
the
that.
restriction?
Well, the restriction is the thing that puts you in jail. You don't want to live in a world of
Restriction is
restriction.
the
and
law.
not
Any
be a
restriction
labor.
could be broken.